It is the Resistance Report for June 1st, 2017, a day that, while it might not live in infamy, it certainly is a sad and even harrowing day in the United States and around the world. Today is the day that Donald Trump decided that he would withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, putting the United States in the company of only two nations around the world who have not joined the Paris Accord, and one was Nicaragua. Nicaragua said it was not going to join because the accord was not strong enough. And the other nation that did not join, the United States is now with, is Syria. And Syria didn't join because Syria had a government that was and still is in the midst of a civil war and just couldn't get it together to join. Every other nation in the world, including North Korea, has joined the Paris Accord. There is absolutely no reason, no excuse, no justification for the United States to not be part of an effort to save the planet. What did Donald Trump use today as his justification? The real justification, you know, is to reward the base. His base, his supporters who he feels, and some of his advisors feel, have been disappointed so far because he hasn't delivered on almost anything he promised. One thing he promised was to get out of the Paris Climate Accord, and his advisors and Donald Trump felt, well, he could deliver on that today, despite the fact that most business executives around America, despite the fact that almost all scientists, despite the fact that his very own daughter, most reasonable people who understand what's at stake, told him not to do it. He did it anyway. And he gave a speech that was just filled with lies. Let's just not beat around the bush. Donald Trump continues to lie. In fact, his whole climate approach has been based on a tissue of lies from the beginning. During the campaign, he said he wasn't convinced that there was climate change, certainly that it was not caused by human beings. And then today in the Rose Garden, what did he say? He claimed the Paris Accord would cost the United States 2.7 million jobs by 2025. That is absolute rubbish. Where did he get that figure, that 2.7 million jobs by 2025? From a report commissioned by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, by industry, and even the authors of the report, even its own authors, said that the research doesn't take into account the potential benefits from avoiding emissions. That study also assumed that energy prices stayed exactly the same as by the year 2025 as they are today, took absolutely no account of any job growth with regard to solar or wind, nor the potential health benefits, nor any other benefits. In other words, it was a sham study created by the industry to give Trump a talking point. And it was baloney. Last year, the truth is, and make sure you spread the truth, because we are under a tyrant who tells lies and justifies things that are absolutely against the public interest, against the world's interest, with a tissue of lies. The truth is that last year, for example, more than twice as many people were employed in the solar industry alone than in coal mining. Coal mining is something that Donald Trump thinks he's going to protect. Well, if you want jobs, go to solar. Go to wind. Between 2010 and 2016, solar grew by over 20% every year. The renewable energy sector is not only creating more jobs than fossil fuels, but also it has a larger multiplier effect. That is, for every job created, those jobs generate even more jobs than in the fossil fuel business. $1 million spent on fossil fuels supports the equivalent of 2.6 full-time jobs. You spend that $1 million on renewables, and you get 7 jobs. That's just simple mathematics. So his lie is not just a lie, it is overlooking where the real jobs are, where the real job growth is. I mean, look at the Keystone XL pipeline, for example. The Keystone XL pipeline will only take how many workers to maintain? 50 workers to maintain the Keystone XL pipeline. Donald Trump is talking about this accord eliminating 2.7 million jobs. Well, by not being in the accord, we are actually reducing our capacity to generate even millions of jobs. We're letting China and Germany and Japan become the world leaders in renewable energy. Other whoppers in today's statement from the Rose Garden. Trump says China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants, so we can't build the plants, but they can, according to this agreement. That is utter rubbish. It's rubbish because the agreement actually was based upon voluntary limits set by each nation. It doesn't say anything about coal. And the fact of the matter is, China has actually reduced its coal emissions and its reliance on coal dramatically. It has cut its use of coal 3 years in a row. What is Donald Trump talking about? He says even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full, it would only reduce emissions by 0.2 degrees. That is the effect it would have on the climate. Only 0.2 degree. Tiny, tiny amount, he says. Well, this is not only misleading, because you got to start somewhere, right? Tackle climate problems. You set a base. You get industry moving toward technological solutions. You get the ball rolling. But by dropping out of the Paris Accord, you're going in the opposite direction. And then he says, and this is a real whopper, he says you need more energy sources in the United States beyond renewables to support 3 or 4% growth, which I expect we will need all forms of available energy. Our country will be at grave risk of brownouts or blackouts. This also is utter rubbish, utter baloney. Where does economic growth come from? It comes from population growth, and it comes from productivity improvements. We are getting, and we're getting, productivity improvements out of the renewable energy. What is he talking about in terms of not having enough energy for 3 or 4% growth? He doesn't know what he's talking about. He says India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020. Think of it. India can double their coal production. We're supposed to get rid of ours. Again, utter nonsense, utter rubbish. Each country sets its own goals, its own standards, its own ways of getting there. And then finally, a final whopper. There are so many lies, but let me just give you a final one I picked out of what he said today. He said, beyond the severe energy restrictions, the Paris Accord includes yet another scheme to redistribute wealth out of the United States through the so-called Green Climate Fund. Nice name. Which calls for developed countries to send $100 billion to developing countries. Well, let me tell you the truth. In the Paris Accord, there was an agreement by developed countries, advanced nations, to provide $100 billion, eventually $100 billion a year, to developing nations to mitigate the effects on their economies of dealing with climate change. The United States has already given the Green Climate Fund $1 billion. Trump describes that $1 billion that we've already given to the Green Climate Fund as costing the United States, he said, a vast fortune, unquote. $1 billion. Well, it sounds like a fortune, doesn't it? It is a rounding error in the federal budget. The federal budget, remember, totals for last year $3.9 trillion. Can we spare $1 billion of that $3.9 trillion to help developing nations cope with global warming? Of course, and of course we should. So far, the largest global polluters have been the United States and Russia and Europe and China. Developing nations, they want to advance. If we want them to advance and also advance in a way that doesn't make the planet uninhabitable, we've got to give them some remuneration. It is only fair. The goal of that funding, by the way, is to help nudge developing nations toward cleaner energy like wind and solar. Instead, if the funding succeeds in lowering emissions by developing nations, who gets the advantage? The United States, Europe, developed nations. by helping nations that are especially vulnerable prepare for the effects of climate change. We would also prevent or minimize the kind of refugee crises that can destabilize entire regions because of climate change. That's what's going on right now. Does Donald Trump not understand any of this? Of course he must. He's not a raving lunatic, is he? No. I think he just simply wants to satisfy his base, who've got nothing so far out of him, and so he feels no compunction about telling lie after lie after lie, and treating the world as if it is a vast zero-sum game in which either the United States wins and everybody else loses, or everybody else wins and the United States loses. Well, it's not. And with regard to climate change, let me make sure you understand, I'm sure you do already, that it is not a zero-sum game. If the United States does not move toward renewables as fast as we can, we are going to suffer. We are going to suffer. If the rest of the country and the rest of the world doesn't move to renewables as fast as possible, we are going to suffer. If the planet is uninhabitable, we and our children and our children's children suffer. So I've got a short message to the rest of the world. We apologize. We understand our responsibilities as human beings who share this planet with you. This is temporary. Donald Trump does not represent, and his views do not reflect the views of most Americans. Most of us did not even vote for Donald Trump. And we are doing everything we possibly can to remove him from office as soon as is legally possible. And when we do, America will once again be a responsible nation. Your questions. Helen Weaver, does Vladimir Putin benefit from Trump's decision to leave the Paris Climate Accord? Well, Helen, I think Putin benefits in two big ways. One, Trump's decision antagonizes the rest of the world, all of our friends, all of our allies, and much of the rest of the world in terms of making America into a kind of beast spreading anti-Americanism. Putin likes anti-Americanism in the rest of the world, believe me. The other big benefit for Putin is that, remember, the biggest resource that Russia is sitting on is fossil fuels, oil and gas. And Putin was probably a little bit concerned that the rest of the world was moving too fast to renewables. He would like to be able to produce as much oil and gas and sell it at the highest price he possibly can. So that Paris Accord was not in the interest of Putin or in the interest of Russia. Once again, Trump is doing Putin's bidding. Next question. Joanna Whitmore. Are leaders in Europe, Merkel or Macron, saying they are willing to renegotiate the Paris Accord? No, they are not willing to negotiate. All they've said today is, we're not going to negotiate, and they should not negotiate. Why should they renegotiate? Last question. Karen Greenberg, as a practical matter, how much of an effect does this have? I mean, beyond the symbolism. Karen, don't underestimate the symbolism, for one thing. This Paris Accord is critically important in terms of signaling a commitment by every nation in the world except now Syria and Guatemala, and also the United States. in terms of not going forward. The other thing that it also is very important to understand is that by not being part of this accord, America says essentially to the rest of the world, we don't care. We don't care about the issue. Oh, by the way, Nicaragua, not Guatemala. Nicaragua, I'm sorry. We don't care about the issue, and therefore defines deviancy down. This is what Donald Trump has done right across, whether we're talking about hate speech, or we're talking about dividing America, or we're talking about the effect on immigrants in the United States of Donald Trump. Every area, what Donald Trump does is he lowers the norm. He signals to friend and foe alike. He signals to the rest of the world and to everyone in the United States that it's okay to be as selfish, as greedy, as mean as is possible. He has opened the dark side and continues to open and legitimize the dark side of America. And in the rest of the world's eyes, I'm afraid this is just another example. I wish I could be more upbeat today. I think that the lesson of all of this is we've got to redouble our efforts to get him out of the White House. This is the end of the Resistance Report tonight. I will see you next week.